Hey, folks. Welcome to the first podcast of the Inclusive Collective. My name is Nadia Butt, and I'm lucky to be co hosting with my friend and colleague, Rob Hadley. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Nadia. So excited to be with you.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here with me. Let's share what we're doing here today. So, the Inclusive Collective is a conversation with and for those who are seeking to understand the complexities around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've been hearing this a lot recently within the business world. And so, we are coming together to celebrate the essence of a particular industry and share the perspectives of those who are advocating for change. And so our goals are really to push the inclusion conversation forward. And we're going to do this by bringing in a broad audience of practitioners, thought leaders, enthusiasts, to really share their perspectives of how they strive to implement inclusive workplaces within their organizations and really like what that looks like from a organizational culture perspective and even just everyday interactions with people.
And we're going to do it in our own little way, aren't we, Nadia?
We will. And the first season is really going to be tailored around the startup world and venture capital. And I'm really excited to talk to the folks that we're going to be featuring who we have a great lineup of founders, investors, and practitioners, um,
Absolutely.
change ambassadors. So I'm really excited to get a better understanding of some of the challenges and some of the successes that they have come across along their journey. So, Rob, I've had the pleasure of working with you in our prior company. We've worked on projects where, we've strategized and analyzed and implemented. And I've been really lucky to observe how you interact with people. You've always led with humility and treated people kindly and with respect. And, over the last year or so, we've been discussing like our own personal interactions and experiences really like as it pertains to inclusion. And I really admire the deep reflection and listening that you have done and, been sharing with me just aspects around bringing more awareness to, your own privilege. You've been just a vocal ally, and I really personally appreciate that. So, this is one of the reasons why I tagged you to come on board this podcast journey with me. So why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, that's all so nice of you to say, Nadia. I
You're welcome.
I wasn't expecting any of that. So it's really nice of you to say. I'm always just happy if people that I worked with previously will just still talk to me. And so you actually want to
Yeah.
work on something with me. That's pretty cool. Um, let's talk a little bit about how I got involved in this work. Um,
Mhm.
when people ask me, okay, you're white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied, presenting person, what are the things that draw you into this work? Why are you passionate about DE&I? And
Yeah.
there's a long list of those. I'm going to touch on just a couple of things right now because
Y
as over the course of the podcast, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the different things that are motivating to me. But
Sure.
first, I think the biggest thing over the last 20 years is the relationship that I have with my wife, right? So we've been together for a long time. She comes from a family that immigrated to the US early in the 1990s. And when I met her, she was working as a nurse, but her real ambition was to be a doctor. She wanted to be a physician, and she had all these people telling her that she couldn't do it, right? So I got to see up
Mhm.
close the struggles that she had, that she went through, the barriers that were put in front of her as a woman, as an immigrant, and as a person of color or from a
Mhm.
minoritized community
Mhm.
in that field of medicine, which you can imagine is especially challenging, right?
Right.
So then
And it's
being in
super competitive in the United States as well.
super competitive. She comes from a background that's, really underrepresented in medicine, right?
Mhm.
And then just being part of her family for 20 years, I've met so many people, not just in her family, but then that entire community. And I've heard their stories and seen all the obstacles that they've had to overcome.
Mhm.
And, that really gives you a deal of perspective on on the privilege that I have. And, so that's been very important for me, those relationships. And then in my own professional experience, the major event that drew me into this was in 2017. I was working for a large US financial services firm in a group called People Analytics. And I was
Mhm.
asked to look into some data around Black executive turnover And I think that I just really didn't expect to find much in terms of interesting data there. I didn't think it
Mhm.
was gonna find any real problems. And what that project turned into was a 3 to 4 year rabbit hole for me where we did one of the
Wow.
deepest analytical dives into representation, into differences in sentiment between the races and genders, about the inclusiveness of that environment, and
Mhm.
into the inequities, in people processes, so probably the deepest dive of any Fortune 500 company at that time. And in
Mm.
that work, we learned a lot of things that I think ranged from interesting to disappointing to startling to things that would, out and out enrage people if they had found these things out. But through the use of that data, we were able to uncover some problems and illuminate some of those issues in our own organization, in our own environment. And at the time, I wondered, with all the deep dives that we were doing, all the money that we were spending, we had a really talented team. I was
Mhm.
wondering if, thinking about all the investments that we were putting in and thinking about companies that weren't putting those investments in or weren't taking it as seriously, I wondered what you would find in those organizations, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And the amount of money that was spent, like, not all the organizations out there have the millions of dollars to spend on efforts like this, and the company you're working for had the talent, the resources, the money, and I can imagine, like you said, 3 to 4 years it took. That's a really long time to uncover, a piece of kinda data, to really start to implement something.
yeah, yeah, no, you hit it on the head. Is organizations with that much talent and resources to be able to pour into looking at something like this where most organizations don't. And if they
Yeah.
did, they probably weren't focused on it at that time, right? So
Right, right.
then fast forward, we hit 2020, right? We
Mhm.
have the killing of George Floyd and a couple of things
Right.
happen, right? So one,
Yeah.
we started to hear about these inequities in the corporate world. And having done all that deep research, I had the same reaction that you probably had or any other person from a minoritized background or woman, and it's
Mhm.
basically like, "Hey, no shit," right? Like, that's
Mhm.
obvious, right? Those are things that
Yeah.
obviously
It's been
have
happening.
it's
Right.
been happening, everyone knows about it, that's not from a background of privilege. So
Mhm.
2, the second thing that happened is after that, all these companies made, these very serious pronouncements that we're gonna do better, that we're really gonna
Mhm.
change. And having worked in large corporations and organizational change,
Mm.
initiatives and transformation work, I'm very skeptical about big corporations changing.
Yeah.
I
It
think
takes
that
time, and
they
it's hard work.
even in the most well-intentioned and even the smallest
Mhm.
change you and I know can be, really, really difficult for people. And so when you talk about making changes around policies, processes, procedures related to race, gender, sexual orientation, age, ableist, and other norms, that's incredibly hard work. And
Right.
it's going to take a lot of time. And if you're not committed to it and focused on it and throwing the weight of the entire organization against it, then you're
Mhm.
not going to be able to make that change, sustain it long term. So that's the work that
Mhm.
I focus on. That's why I started my own firm to do strategy and analytics around DEI to help organizations make better decisions in the long
That's
term.
fantastic. Yeah, and it's so interesting, Rob, too, because the change, of course, we know change is really hard, especially in organizations, and I think you kinda said something that I think it's important as we, continue our with season 1 is we look at diversity and inclusion as, like, a separate entity within the organization when really shouldn't it be embedded within, like, the norms and the practices and the behaviors of or, like, leaders and teams and people, and I feel like the more we continue to separate it, the more it is separated. And so it's just really interesting. We've done this work kind of through organizational effectiveness, through change management, lean initiatives, and these efforts fail. And I hope it doesn't. I have high hopes, but it is interesting to see kind of these organizations go through this challenge and struggle right now.
Yeah, and you're starting to see it shift in the way that you'd hope to see it. There are a lot more leader led initiatives, and I think that we're on the right track there. But like I said,
Hmm.
it has to be the main focus or a main focus of the organization has to be completely embedded in the way that an organization is working and managing and leading. And if it's not, then it will have a hard time sustaining. So, but
Absolutely.
let's talk about you, right? Let's say
Oh,
some nice
okay.
things about you. Let's introduce Nadia to our audience, right? And so, you said a bunch of nice things. A lot of these things are very common between the two of us, right? So we work together, but one of my favorite things about you, other than the
Ah,
fact that you have these, lived experiences that I can't necessarily, replicate, and I can't necessarily bring to this discussion, right? As what we would call a woman of color, or what you would call a member of the emerging majority,
Global
right?
majority.
Emerging
I'm
global
a person of
majority.
the global majority community.
Right, right. And so, like, I think that why our collaboration will work, in terms of our skill set and our expertise. I mean, you have a real learning development background, and that perspective of how can we teach people these concepts? How can we give them tools to use, and how do we change their behaviors or increase their competency around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I've seen you personally work with audiences, connect with audiences, and they love you and they adore you,
Uh,
and everyone
Thanks.
loves working with you. And so I think you'll be a great guide for our listeners on this journey, and especially as we bring on these guests. In the case of season one, founders, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists from various backgrounds. I think you'll just be a great person to connect with these folks, and I'm excited to see you interact with them. And as I've said,
Well, I appreciate it.
you'll be everyone's favorite, and,
Aw, that's sweet.
there'll be a lot of, "Why is he here?"
No,
from
they'll
our
love us
guests,
just the same.
but that's okay. That's okay. I'm
No,
used to it.
that's
But please tell us about yourself now.
well, I appreciate that. Yeah, so, my background is that I have worked in the organizational development space, for 18 years now. Yikes. I say 18, close to 20, so that's that's a long time for me. With a focus on leadership development, like you had said, learning development. And so, I've spent most of the time with two Fortune 500 companies where I worked in the corporate learning development space. I've worked with like leaders and teams on change management initiatives, organizational effectiveness programs, and lean methodology. And I was, responsible for really incorporating or embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and behaviors across the leadership and professional development curriculum. I'm currently the founder and principal consultant at NAS Consulting, where we provide global coaching and solutions and strategy to leaders and teams.
Nice.
Most recently, I have consulted for like leaders and stakeholders on creating a strategic kind of diversity and inclusion vision that's aligned to their organization's mission and goals, and help them guide through on how to like operationalize that. And so that means a lot of, creating implementation plans or communication plans. I do a lot of trainings around that, workshops, as it relates to coaching and inclusion in the workplace.
So you do it all.
Uh,
You just do it
I
all.
I don't do it all. I
Yeah.
definitely, do a lot, but I don't do it all, and you've done this work from, this work respectively through, like, a change management, lens at prior companies, and, it's hard work, yet really rewarding work. We get to see people change behaviors, really listen, share stories, and so forth, but yeah, so my passion around diversity and inclusion really stems from a few things. So I identify as a female, Pakistani American, Muslim, child of immigrants. And, throughout my life, I have definitely experienced both, covert and overt discrimination and microaggressions. In the workplace, though, I also have experienced, and observed microaggressions or micro workplace discrimination. And I've observed colleagues struggle with inclusive behaviors. And this really drove me to become more passionate about transforming workplace culture. So throughout my career, I really wanted to focus on how to help leaders and people and peers think about what an inclusive culture is, what it looks like, how it feels, how people's behaviors impact people, what the intention is around some behaviors. So my goal is really to support and developing more inclusive behaviors as well. When I think back to like the past of like dig deep about like why am I so passionate about this work? Where did it really like come from? And I'll tell you, like when 9/11 happened, I was in college and I remember one of my professors telling me not to share that I was a Muslim in my interviews.
Mm,
And when I was going for like job interviews. And when I did enter the workplace at the time, my first job out of college, I wasn't even sharing that I was Pakistani or Muslim with my colleagues
mm.
because there was a really strong anti-Muslim sentiment out there, especially in the United States.
I think people today have a hard time remembering just how anti-Muslim the United States
It
was at that
was.
time, right?
Yeah, especially after 9/11. And
Yeah.
so, I was hesitant to share, that I was Pakistani or Muslim out of fear, and so as I got closer to, like, certain colleagues and certain managers, I definitely, like, was able to share who I was. I wasn't really nervous about hiding who I was. As I joined teams, in the workplace, like, as my career kinda developed and I was becoming, part of different teams and more diverse teams, I felt more valued, and that in turn kinda helped me bring my authentic self to work. So I became a little bit more vocal around, like, "Oh, this is who I am, this is what I celebrate, these are some of my traditions and customs," because people would ask, and so it was like, it was great to share. And then as soon as that happened, the Muslim ban happened in 2017. And, all of this like rhetoric around Islamophobia came back, and the stereotypes about being brown or being an immigrant or a child of immigrant just really started to resurface. And like, let's face it, it was already there.
Mhm.
So it wasn't necessarily, it was resurfacing, but the impacts were kind of already still there. So I just started taking note about and observing really like how people were interacting with one another, how leaders were interacting, how colleagues were treating each other. And I was just curious how organizations were going to, create inclusive cultures if they hadn't already or if it wasn't a focus. This drove me into furthering my education. So,
Mhm.
as you know, I'm currently a doctoral candidate, and my current research right now is focused on identity and belonging in the workplace, but particularly the Muslim experience, the American Muslim experience.
Yes,
Um,
yes, and when do we get to call
yeah.
you doctor, Nadia?
Oh my gosh, it's
Right.
gonna be at least another year from now, because I gotta write that dissertation.
Can I
So,
start on this podcast?
I mean,
Is
maybe,
there some
not yet.
ethical rule that you have to wait?
No, not yet. Don't call me
Right.
Dr. Butt. The only doctor in our family is my dad, so not yet.
Okay,
Um,
fair enough.
but, then the events of 2020 happened. So what's so interesting is, like, we found ourselves in, the global pandemic. The workforce shifted in terms of, remote work or hybrid work, and then George Floyd was killed. And then we had the Black Lives Matter protests where, they were happening, and then we have, like, the Great Resignation happen, and boom, the idea of a traditional workplace, like, shifted, right? So, like, culture shifted and norms shifted, and people became remote in terms of how they worked, and, then we have, like, a global concern where, like, organizations and, companies are global, so there's an international factor.
Mm,
And so the focus on diversity and inclusion efforts became focused and then I think about like even how organizations now are incorporating wellness because of like the pandemic fatigue or other situations around wellness and sustainability efforts. And so I just found myself thinking like how can I take in everything that I've learned or experienced or observed and help leaders and teams be better. And so, how can I contribute to like advocate for social justice within the workplace?
mhm.
And so I was like, oh, well, why not a podcast? Of course.
Yeah. That's that should
So,
do it.
so here we are.
Yeah.
When we started discussing this idea, I anchored you. I tapped on you to really help me kind of brainstorm what this could look like. And the reason why, if you recall, is earlier last year, I was asked to speak at a webinar for the Mars organization. And they have a pet care group, particularly their accelerator program for their aspiring like startup groups and founders to do like a foundational DE&I, kind of like a awareness building for them for that group. And so what I realized in the conversations with like many of these founders and co-founders was that they had not only great questions and that they were curious, but they really wanted like more support in how to build inclusive teams. And I talked to you about this and I was like, I wondered just like why were they struggling with like building these inclusive teams or what was like their struggles. And I did ask them a lot, but you and I started prompting these questions. And then you joined me in the next round of this group conversation with this company. And, our takeaways were that within the startup world, there's not a lot of resources or funds or even sometimes time or talent to really help build that inclusive culture. And so, even though the intention might be there, we noticed that maybe there wasn't a lot of other kind of resources available or tools available for these folks.
I don't think that you say the intention might be there. I think that what we've seen is that it really is there, right? I mean, if you think about, we're talking about startups, people are trying to build companies. They obviously want to build long-lasting, durable companies that create value and build value for the future. And so part of that is building a culture that can sustain and innovate. And so therefore, there's a lot of questions and a lot of interest from startup founders and investors about
Investors.
DEI.
Yep. Absolutely.
Nadia, as we dive into our series, and if you didn't catch it, we're going to start our first season working on the startups and the venture capital industry. Let's get a little bit of perspective on what startup means and why they're so important to the US economy. They're super important in terms of job and wealth creation in the United States. We'll look at the gaps that exist in representation in the US startup and VC industry and talk about why giving founders and investors some guideposts to follow is so important and can be so impactful for our economy, right? So, first, let's be very clear, right? You know this. We know that when we're talking about startups, we're not talking about what is commonly referred to as small business, right? So
Mm.
someone wants to
Oh,
start a
what's the
single taco.
difference? Yeah.
So someone wants to start a single taco truck, right?
Yeah.
And I think you and I are on the same page that the world can never have too many of these taco trucks,
Love
right?
Taco Tuesday.
That but that's not the startup that we're focusing on. We're talking about startup in the couple of people in their garage or dorm room or basement or whatever working to solve a problem
Mhm.
that they believe can become a big business, right? So that sense of the term, the definition I like most there is that startup is an idea in search of a scalable business model,
Okay.
right? And so the largest companies in our modern world come from this universe. Facebook, I'm sorry,
Meta.
Meta,
Yeah.
the Microsoft, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, all of them started with a founder or co-founders. They innovated, they solved a problem, they scaled, they became the world dominating, soul crushing, antitrust violating behemoths that we know them as today, right?
Mm,
So, and these companies are incredibly important, right? So it's estimated that although a couple facts for you here, right? So
mm.
although the annual venture investment is something like just 0.2% of GDP, venture-backed firms produce over 20% of GDP. And they have job growth rates 8 times the rate of non-venture-backed private companies.
Oh,
And
wow.
and those will continue and are accelerating. In 2020, there was, so get this, right? In 2020, there were 10,862 US companies receiving venture funding of $164 billion. That was a record at the time. Then in 2021, that number doubled to 330 billion, right?
Mm,
And so it in a lot of ways, the venture capital sector is really the last place of exceptionalism in the American economy. It's enormously important and super vital to everything that happens in this country. And you would think, right, that this energetic, exciting industry fueled by, exceptional young talent, visionary leaders thriving in our great coastal cities like San Francisco,
yeah, people who are, like, super innovative, right? Have that, like, mindset to be super innovative.
super innovative. They probably pride themselves as being super progressive. They live in big cities, right?
Mhm.
And they're thought leaders, right? They're always one step ahead of the game. That's how they
Right.
pride themselves. So you'd think that they must be really good at these issues, right? Have a
Mhm.
stellar track record in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
You
But
would
they
think that.
you would think that,
Do
but
you
do
don't?
they?
You
Well,
don't
it's
think that?
it's not that I don't think that they don't have a track record. I think through the questions and just through the conversations, it's like that again, some people I think there's intentions, solid intentions to want to have these inclusive workforces, work teams, and cultures, but the resources are not available. And then I think it's not on some people's radar. I don't think that's people think about it. Maybe it's like a thought that like, yes, I would like to do this, but the implementation of it is hard. And that reminds me too, like, I don't even know if people are aligned on verbiage, right? So like when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, like do people even know, is there like a there's not an aligned kind of understanding. I think a lot of people use language and terms in very different ways because it's defined in many different ways. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So go
Well,
ahead.
how would you define it?
Yeah, I mean, so diversity is pretty simple. It's just the presence of differences. So there's many dimensions of diversity. I'm not going to go into like a full on training right now. I don't think anybody wants to have one of my like, diversity and inclusion foundation training in this podcast. But if you do, you can contact me at NAS Consulting. But the presence of differences is really, so when you think about the dimensions of diversity, there's racial differences, there's gender differences, there's LGBTQ differences, there's differences in education, socioeconomic status. So there's a plethora of differences. And in the United States right now, we are focused on mostly gender and race. I think there's definitely focuses on the disability community, on the community of LGBTQ, but that's not the case in every organization. And so that is diversity. Then you have inclusion, which where people who are marginalized or have marginalized identities, they feel that they belong or they feel like they are valued. That they're relied upon, that they're empowered, right? So that's the definition of inclusion. Then there's some other terms that are being kind of used right now, and there's equity. So equity is ensuring that everyone has access to the same opportunities and resources that are
Yep.
available.
Yep.
And sometimes they're not available, and that's accessibility. So you think of accessibility as like the design of products or services or even environments where people have open opportunities, where people can have open opportunities to access like the different products and services that might be available to them and of people who have different backgrounds. And
That
then this
was,
yeah. There's
no,
one
it was just
yeah.
one more.
One more.
One more.
There's one
Okay.
more term, and it's this term of belonging, and people are like, "Well, what's the difference between belonging and inclusion?" Like, could you describe that? Like, do you
Between belong
Yeah,
I think so. Belonging to me is like that is the outcome of all those things, right? So like the outcome of an inclusive environment is that people feel like they belong, that they're part of something bigger, and that they're valued. And I think of belonging as almost like the ultimate outcome of a great mix of all those other key
exactly.
elements.
Exactly. Belonging is like this really like sense of self. And so you might have an organization that is, diverse in the sense of like you have representation. You might include me in a meeting. So like you might hire me and then you might decide that I belong in this meeting and that's inclusion. But I might not actually feel like I belong there. That's a sense of self. And so you're right. The outcome is to like have people feel like they belong. So how do you foster these safe, like psychologically safe, Amy Edmondson talks a lot about this from Harvard, these psychologically safe and, foster environments that are inclusive, that provide empowerment and so on and so forth. And that's really hard to do, I think, in general at organizations, and then even probably more harder to do in the startup world because it takes time, it takes talent, it takes resources, and it takes a really lot of understanding.
Well, that was perfect and amazing,
No, you're
and
welcome.
setting that up in terms of DEI and
Thank you,
B,
Rob.
you added
Yeah,
belonging in there as well.
yeah.
So now hold all that in your mind, and now come back with me to our
Mhm.
startup friends. As I was talking about how big that industry is, and so according to Crunchbase, of that 164 billion that we talked about invested in startups in 2020, only single-digit percentages went to Black, Latinx, and women, LGBTQ plus founders.
Wow.
Of the VCs making the investments in those entrepreneurs, only 4% of VCs are Black, 5% are Latinx, and according to Allraise, only 13% of decision makers at US venture firms are women.
Mhm.
So how are we doing? So based on what the definition that you just gave, how did you
Terrible. I mean, it's terrible. The representation's not there, and then, this begs me to ask so many questions that that's part of the reason why I really started to think about, like, why is there not an avenue or resource to help understand, like, the complexities around specific industries? So, like, let's focus on that for a second. I won't have all the answers. You definitely have more than I have, but I don't think you have all of them, and so that's why I think right?
No,
That's
that's where you're wrong. I do. I have all of them.
But I think that's why it's so important to invite guests that have experienced this world, right? It's their lived and professional experiences that are going to tell us these stories around, look, what are they experiencing? And I have so many questions around, like, why are there only 4% of Black or brown venture capitalists? Like, why is it such a majority white I think white male, and that's an assumption I could be making, industry. And so, typically when you think about resources and networking, you usually tap on your network, and your network tends to look like you. It tends to look and represent people like you. So
Yep,
I'm not
yep.
surprised at that if the people who have the funding are likely going to invest in people within their network that probably look like them. And so I'm not surprised, but it's interesting that those were the types of questions that I was coming up with.
Yeah, so let's talk about how we're going to answer those questions, right? Let's talk a little bit about season one, focus on startups and venture capital. So we're going to highlight the perspectives of those founders, those investors, and we're going to do it in order. We're going to try to walk people through the way a startup grows, right? And
Yeah.
so we'll follow startups through various stages of maturity, and then we'll look at different people and culture issues with a DEI lens along the way, right?
Yep.
And so tell us about so now tell us how it's going to go.
Yeah, so we have a few episodes here. Right now we're at 8, and throughout the podcast we may expand because I feel like there's other conversations we'd like to have, but our
We
first
keep coming
episode
up with new
we
ideas,
keep
right?
coming up with new ideas, which leads me to the first episode. So, the first episode is going to be focused on idea formation. So, we will have a guest who will talk us through kind of their service or product, or like the gap that they saw in their marketplace, and why that was like something that they really wanted to close the gap on. The second episode will focus on the founding team. So, what was that, kind of like relationship with? Maybe it was a solo venture, maybe it was just a founder, but also maybe it was a team. So maybe there was a co-founding team. So what was that dynamic? What were kind of the complexities around the founding team? The third episode would be focused on product development. So as they were trying to think through like the implementation of closing that gap, what were some of the things that they had to do in terms of reaching out to maybe third party vendors, or continue forming a team, and who they needed to seek help from and resources from. And then episode 4 will focus on raising money. So just that, who they turned to, if they didn't have the funds themselves, and how they went about that, and what that all looks like.
And I'm super excited once we get there, right? That's probably I'll tell you that's one of my things I'm most excited to talk about.
Yeah.
As you talk to minoritized or diverse founders, they'll all jump in and want to tell you about their experience about raising money and what a pain in the ass it was, whether it was a woman talking to a room full of white men, or the primarily white venture class or exec or investor class not being able to relate to a particular product and service. So I'm super excited about episode 4.
Yeah.
Then we're going to turn around. We're going to talk to the actual investors, right? We're going to
Yes.
get some of our friends in the venture capital community come and talk about the challenges in from that perspective of investing in diverse founders and challenges in the VC industry itself. From there, we'll move on and start to talk about okay, you've got some money, and now you have to build a company, right? So we'll talk about culture building in a very fast growing organization.
Mhm.
And then we'll talk about things like hiring, right? So how are you going to scale up and start to hire people? What are the challenges there? Before talking to some folks that have actually scaled a company, and we'll talk about what are the challenges when you actually do hit it big, when you do start to scale, and you're not so small anymore, right?
Mhm.
And you're not necessarily the small company. You can't necessarily control the environment anymore. What are the things you need to have in place? That's the 8 episodes we have there. There could be a few surprises along the way. What are you most excited about?
I
I already claimed one.
Yeah, I'm really excited just to hear the conversations from, I mean, obviously everyone, but me, I'm so around the people practices, so I'm really excited to talk about like how founders like form their teams, and like what were the dynamics within that they started to observe, and like the culture shift, and when did they start to notice that. So I'm really excited about that. I also just like want to point out, I know we touched upon this earlier, is that like, yeah, this season is focused on startups, and founders and investors and thought leaders. but it's not the our listeners can don't have to be from that demographic. And I think that's what's going to be really cool is that I think there are going to be lessons and learned from their experiences that can actually really support in whatever industry or work that someone else might be doing in a different organization or different industry.
Yeah, I mean, very specifically, you can think about the corporate world always looks to the startup world to understand, how they can be more innovative or how they can be more dynamic, right? And
Right.
so, some of the things that we cover in this podcast or in this first season will be very applicable to large organization as well, and we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Sure thing. A few things, administrative things about our podcast. We're going to drop an episode every 2 weeks. So
That's
be on the,
exciting.
yeah,
Administrative, huh?
be
Yeah.
on the lookout for that, folks. And, definitely we always look for feedback. Both Rob and I, really
Positive,
value
positive feedback,
positive
right?
feedback is good, but constructive is always really good.
Okay,
We are
fine.
both very reflective people, and so the podcast in itself is going to really advocate for the experiences, but also the reflections after these experiences. That's where that's where my learning background kicks in, which I am passionate about. So feedback is a gift. If you do have any feedback, please direct that to www.rifelion.com. And as always, once you listen, we'd love for you to subscribe to our podcast. We like you for you to rate it, and that's 5 stars. And then definitely give us a review on your podcast platform.
All
And
right.
that's it. That's all I got for you today.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be awesome. I appreciate you invited me along again, Nadia, and let's have a good time.
I'm excited for this, Rob. All right, take care, everybody.
Bye.